31, 1223. The steppes of southern Russia, near the Kalka River. Somewhere along a column of knights riding in triumphant procession, a single man surveyed the open steppe before him and felt no confidence. While the other princes celebrated 9 consecutive days of victories, while the entire coalition chased after an enemy that appeared to be fleeing in disarray, this man saw a trap. And he was the only one who was right. The secret of what happened at the Kalka River lies not in numbers. It lies not in anyone's bravery or cowardice. It lies in a decision, a single decision, that a single commander made when every other chose differently. And the story of how that decision worked was betrayed, and was nearly erased from the record of what we know about how to stop the Mongols, is what this video is going to tell. This is not the story you think you know. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming. An army that should have been unbeatable advances across the steppe with the swelling confidence of those who have already decided they've won. Russian and Cuman knights blanket the horizon with banners and dust. The horses are tired, but morale is high. Because for 9 straight days, every single time this army pressed forward, the enemy fell back. 9 days of victory after victory. 9 days that convinced virtually every commander in this coalition that the battle was already won. Virtually everyone. Mstislav Romanovich, Prince of Kiev, the most senior commander of this coalition, studied the terrain and saw something different. He saw an enemy retreating with too much order. He saw a steppe that opened into ground increasingly favorable to anyone wishing to wheel around and attack. He saw his own forces stretched thin, fragmented, drifting ever farther from their reserves. He saw the moment before disaster. What none of the other princes there knew, and what Mstislav the Old would only come to understand in the hours ahead, in the worst possible way, was that there existed a weapon capable of stopping the most devastating army in the world. A simple weapon, so simple that the Mongols had never expected anyone to use it against them. This is the story of the Battle of the Kalka River. But more than that, it is the story of why that weapon was forgotten, of how one man proved it worked, and of how he died before anyone could learn what he had discovered. To understand what happened at the Kalka, you first need to understand who the coalition was truly dealing with. And that begins not in 1223, not on the Russian steppes, but years earlier, in a campaign that redefined what was possible in war. Between 1219 and 1221, the army of Genghis Khan decimated the Khwarezmian Empire. Khwarezm was, at that moment, one of the largest and wealthiest states in the Islamic world, an empire stretching from what is now Iran to Afghanistan, with cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Urgench, with vast armies, with walls that had withstood invaders for centuries. In 2 years, it was destroyed. The cities were burned. The populations were massacred or enslaved. Sultan Jalal ad-Din fled with the remnants of his forces to the south, pursued. 2 generals were dispatched to hunt him down, Jebe and Subutai. Jebe, the arrow, the general who had begun his relationship with Genghis Khan by nearly killing the Khan himself in battle, and who when captured told the truth about what he had done, because that was the kind of man he was. Genghis Khan, who admired courage and honesty above almost any other human quality, made him a general. He was a warrior of incomprehensible speed, of calculated aggression, with the ability to keep his troops moving at a pace his adversaries considered humanly impossible. Subutai, the bow, the strategist, the architect of battles, the man Genghis Khan called his faithful hound, who had never lost a campaign. Subutai thought about logistics and geography on a scale his adversaries simply could not process. Where other generals saw battles, Subutai saw campaigns. Where other commanders planned days ahead, Subutai planned years. He was the kind of general who chose the site of a battle weeks before the battle was fought, and then herded the enemy toward that site, without the enemy ever realizing it was being herded. The official mission was to pursue Sultan Jalal ad-Din. The real mission was something else: to explore the West, to see what lay beyond the Caucasus, to measure the strengths, the geographies, the political divisions of the peoples who lived as far as the eye could see, and to destroy anything that tried to stop them, not out of cruelty, but because every victory was a data point. What tried to stop them was considerable. In 1221, the Georgians. Georgia was a regional power with a respectable military tradition and intimate knowledge of its terrain. They marched out to face Jebi and Subutai with confidence. They were destroyed. Not defeated, not forced to retreat. Destroyed as a fighting force. Then the Alans, a confederation of mountain warriors from the northern Caucasus. The Mongols engaged them briefly, calculated that dividing was more efficient than destroying them outright, and did exactly that. They promised the Alans' Cuman allies they would not attack them if they stood aside. The Cumans stood aside. The Alans were massacred. Then the Mongols attacked the Cumans too. This sequence, apparent alliance, calculated betrayal, division, destruction, was no accident. It was Subutai's signature, ties. And when the Cuman survivors fled north seeking help, they did not know they were carrying this method with them like an invisible Trojan horse. What arrived at the borders of Russia in 1223 was not a horde of plunderers. It was the most experienced army in the world, led by the greatest living strategist, with 2 years of consecutive victories behind it, and a mental map of an entire continent forming in its commander's mind. That desperate father-in-law arriving with gifts and pleas from the north was named Kotyan, and the request he carried was simple, impossible, and the only chance Russia had, that its worst enemies become its allies before it was too late. The alliance that would save Russia should never have existed. For generations, decades of raids, of reprisals, of borders defended and violated, the Russian princes and the Cumans, also known as Kipchaks, had been enemies. The Cumans raided the southern borders of the Russian principalities. The Russians pushed them back into the steppes. It was a cycle of violence that had defined the region for more than a century. The hatred between these forces was not political. It was cultural. It was inherited. It was the kind of animosity that does not dissolve in a war council. And then Kotyan Khan appeared with a message that made that hatred irrelevant. Kotyan was the leader of the Western Cumans, and he held an ace that made his mission possible. His daughter had married Mstislav Mstislavich, Prince of Galicia. The family connection opened a door that politics would have otherwise kept shut, and Kotyan pressed through that door with the full urgency of a man who had seen with his own eyes what the Mongols did to their enemies. He did not arrive with words alone. He arrived with gifts: horses, camels, buffalo, furs, slave women, carefully distributed among every prince he needed to persuade. It was high-level diplomacy dressed in desperation, and his message was simple and terrifying. The Mongols destroy everyone. Today they took our land. Tomorrow they will take yours. If we do nothing now, there will be no one left to do anything later. The Council of Princes convened. The debate was long and tense, because what Kotyan was asking was for Russian princes to die for Cumans, for men who had spent their entire lives defending their borders against this very people, to now march out and save them. There were princes who wanted to refuse. There were legitimate reasons to refuse. But Mstislav the Bold, Prince of Galicia, young, brilliant, with a track record of victories that justified every ounce of his confidence, said they would go. And the other princes, out of loyalty, political pressure, or the simple recognition that if the Cumans fell, Russia's southern frontier would lie open to whatever came next, agreed. Russians and Cumans would fight together. What generations of conflict had failed to achieve, the fear of a common enemy accomplished in weeks. The resulting coalition was genuinely extraordinary. Mstislav the Bold, of Galicia, Mstislav Romanovich the Old, of Kiev, the most senior prince, the most experienced, the most cautious. Mstislav of Chernigov, with his own calculations, a principality neighboring Kiev with its own ambitions and historical reasons not to blindly trust the other two princes any more than necessary. Kotyan's Cumans, the highest quality steppe cavalry available. Medieval estimates of this force's size range from 20 to 80,000. Medieval numbers are always suspect, always inflated, but it was one of the largest armies medieval Russia had ever assembled. And then the Mongol ambassadors arrived. Subutai sent a delegation with an elaborate and familiar message. We have no quarrel with the Russians. Our dispute is with the Cumans, who attacked us. Stand aside. Let us settle our matter with them. It was the same divide and conquer play that had worked with the Alans. Word for word, the same strategy. And there were Russian princes who wanted to accept, because why die for Cumans? But Mstislav the Bold said no. The other princes agreed. The Mongol ambassadors were executed. Consider this moment for a second. Not as an act of bravery, but as a strategic decision. Because what the Russian princes had just done was not simply reject a peace proposal. They had just closed every diplomatic exit. They had made total war inevitable. And they had handed Subutai the one thing he needed, under the conventions of Mongol warfare. And these were conventions that Genghis Khan had codified and that his generals followed rigorously. Killing ambassadors made complete destruction not merely justified, but mandatory. It was a law of war. The Russian princes did not know this, but by executing those men, they stepped into that logic all the same. The only path forward was the one Subutai had prepared, and the coalition walked it willingly. But there was one man in this coalition who was about to discover something that all the others would miss, and who would carry that discovery to his grave before anyone could ask what he had learned. You will understand exactly what that discovery was. But before that, you need to understand why it was so difficult to see when everything was happening. The coalition advanced south in the late spring of 1223. Scouting forces encountered the Mongols near Khortytsia Island on the Dnieper River around May 23rd. There was a skirmish. The Mongols retreated. The coalition advanced. The Mongols retreated further. And then, for 9 consecutive days, the same sequence repeated itself. The feigned retreat was one of the most devastating tactics in the Mongol repertoire. But what almost no one understands is that there were 2 completely different types. The tactical type, where riders pretend to flee for minutes or hours, luring the enemy out of position, then turn and attack, was the version that appeared in history books. The Mongols used it constantly. It was brutal and effective. The maneuver Subutai executed on the road to the Kalka River was on a far greater scale. It was not a battlefield trick. It was an entire campaign operation. And here is the secret that the Battle of the Kalka River almost buried forever. There was a weapon against the Mongols, not a weapon of steel, a weapon of terrain and decision. And in the 9 days that followed, Subutai was deliberately creating the conditions for no one to use it, except one man. But that comes later. First, the mechanics. Each day's march and pursuit exhausted the coalition's horses and men, while the Mongols controlled the pace, advancing when it suited them, stopping when they needed to. The coalition was forced to follow the enemy's step, which is always a strategically inferior position. And as the pursuit stretched on, the faster forces, the Cuman cavalry and Mstislav the Bold, pushed further and further ahead. The slower reserves fell further and further behind. What had set out as a reasonably cohesive army was becoming, kilometer by kilometer, a stretched column where different parts could not support one another quickly enough. Meanwhile, Subutai was choosing his ground. The Kalka River was no accidental destination. The steppes near the river offered exactly what classic Mongol tactics required: space for encircling maneuvers on multiple fronts, lines of approach that favored attacks from different angles, and the crucial combination of terrain open enough for fast cavalry, yet without the topographical features: defensive hills, forests, rivers, and protected positions that would neutralize the Mongol advantage. But the most insidious effect of those 9 days was not physical, it was psychological. Each Mongol retreat confirmed a narrative in the princes' minds. We are winning. Each victory by the vanguard fed their confidence. And confidence, in this specific context, was poison. Because a confident army does not hold formation, does not check its flanks, does not question whether what appears to be a victory is in fact what it seems. The coalition was not hunting the Mongols. The coalition was being led, like cattle to a slaughterhouse, never once seeing the butcher ahead, only the path that seemed to go forward. This level of manipulation was made possible not only by the genius of Subutai, but by a structural flaw within the coalition itself, a flaw that no day of marching, no apparent victory, could ever have corrected. Because this army that Subutai was herding into his trap was not an army. It was three. There was no unified command. Each prince operated with his own force, under his own banner, with his own political objectives. And this was not merely a matter of ego. It was the structural reality of the medieval Russian principalities, where power was personal, loyalty was territorial, and authority did not cross political lines without prior negotiation. Mstislav the Bold of Galicia, young, brilliant, impatient, he was the one who had convinced all the others to join. He was the one leading the pursuit. He had everything to gain from a decisive victory: glory, prestige, and the permanent title of the prince who had defeated the horsemen of the apocalypse. Throughout his entire career, he had never encountered an enemy that did not yield when pressed. 9 days of Mongol retreat only confirmed what he already knew about himself. Mstislav Romanovich the Old of Kiev, the most senior prince present, with decades of politics and war behind him. A man who had survived because he had never confused momentum with advantage. When everyone else saw an enemy fleeing, he saw an enemy choosing where and when to fight. Mstislav of Chernigov, operating with his own calculations, a principality with a history of rivalry with Kiev, with reasons not to subordinate himself to Mstislav the Old any more than necessary. On the battlefield, this meant a third center of gravity operating on its own terms. And then there was the question of the Cumans. The Cumans were extraordinary steppe horsemen, fast, skilled, perfectly adapted to plains warfare. But nomadic steppe warfare is inherently built on mobility and opportunism. Attack when the opportunity presents itself. Withdraw when it does not. This style of combat was almost identical to the Mongol way. The Cumans knew how to use feigned retreats because they used them themselves. What they did not know was how to recognize when they were the ones falling victim to them. There was also the question of loyalty. Some medieval chronicles suggest that the Mongols had contacted Cuman subcommanders individually, not Kotyan, but leaders at the level below. The pattern was documented. Subutai had done exactly this with the Alan's Cuman allies years before. It is speculation supported by historical evidence, not confirmed fact, but the behavior of the Cuman contingents during the battle would make far more sense as coordinated action than as random panic. The man who was about to make the only lucid decision had no way of getting anyone else to follow him. Mstislav the Old arrived at the Kalka River on May 31st, 1223, looked at the terrain before him, looked at the increasingly distant vanguard forces, and stopped. While everyone else rushed toward the battle Subutai had prepared for them, a single prince chose a different fight. And the question that will change everything about what you're about to see is simple. What exactly did he see that everyone else chose not to see? May 31st, 1223 began like just another dawn of pursuit. The vanguard forces of Mstislav the Bold crossed the Kalka River and pressed toward the Mongol positions. The Cuman contingents advanced with them on the flank. Confidence was absolute. Why would today be any different from the last 9 days? Today was different because Subutai had decided it would be. The signal came from somewhere within the Mongol ranks. A shift in formation. An order passed between 20 to 30,000 warriors who had trained together for years and who each knew exactly what to do when the moment came. The Mongols stopped retreating. And then they came. Not from one direction, from multiple directions simultaneously. The Tulugma, the classic Mongol envelopment maneuver, is not something improvised on the battlefield. It is a maneuver that requires space to execute, time to position, and an enemy who is exactly where you need them to be. After 9 days of pursuit, the coalition was precisely where Subutai needed them to be. Vanguard forces separated from the reserves, exposed flanks. A line stretched too thin to regroup quickly. The Cumans were the first to break. What exactly happened to the Cuman contingents at the Kalka River is one of the small mysteries of this battle. Medieval Russian chronicles blame cowardice. Some modern historians point to the possible bribery of sub-commanders, the same pattern that had worked against the Alans. Others suggest sheer panic under a charge of a scale and coordination the Cumans had never faced before. The likely truth is a combination. But the outcome was identical regardless of the cause. The Cumans broke and fled. And when a unit beside you breaks in panic on a medieval battlefield, the effect is devastating. Your flank is exposed. The forces that had been engaged with that unit are now free to turn against you, and the sight of allies in flight triggers something primal that training rarely fully suppresses. The cascade effect was immediate. Mstislav the Bold, who had led this expedition with such flair, who had pursued the Mongols for 9 days imagining himself the hunter, found his position torn apart within minutes. The Cuman flight exposed his flank. The Mongols pivoted inward with the speed that made them legendary. The front line dissolved into complete encirclement. The prince who had been the architect of this unlikely coalition discovered within a matter of minutes that he had been the prey all along. Mstislav of Chernigov, operating between the two main forces, was captured in the chaos. Part of his force was destroyed. The rest fled. The battle, for the forward 2/3 of the coalition, was devastatingly short. The army that had chased the Mongols for 9 days turned into fleeing refugees within a matter of hours. And then there was Mstislav the Old. The Prince of Kiev had watched all of this from the position he had chosen, elevated, with a clear line of sight, at a careful distance from the river crossing. And as chaos spread before him, as allies disappeared and the vanguard contingents were destroyed, the elder prince made the only decision that made sense. He did not flee. He did not advance. He built. This is the moment history forgot, and it is the most important of all. The fortification that Mstislav the Old raised on that hill near the Kalka River was no improvised act of desperation. It was the deliberate application of the only tactic that worked against the Mongols, and one that worked for a reason so simple, it is almost hard to believe it took someone this long to use it. Mongol cavalry was invincible in open ground. The speed, the encirclement, the mastery of the long-range horsebow, nothing in the medieval world of 1223 could compete with that on flat steppe terrain. But cavalry is cavalry, and cavalry against a prepared defensive position on high ground, with physical obstacles, is an entirely different proposition. Obstacles eliminate the advantages that make cavalry powerful. The space for flanking maneuvers disappears. The favorable angle for archers disappears. The speed, which is the source of everything, disappears. Mstislav used everything he had. Hastily built wooden palisades, wagons forming a laager, a circle of vehicles acting as an improvised wall around the perimeter. The elevated position that denied Mongol archers the high angle from which their bows were most devastating. And the most important thing, the thing that required the most discipline at a moment when everything around was collapsing, he kept his force completely united. No pursuit, no opportunistic counterattacks, pure, integrated, coordinated resistance. The Mongols attacked, first with cavalry, testing the perimeter at multiple points, searching for the place where resolve would give way. The palisades and wagons forced riders to dismount or compress into narrow spaces where numbers did not translate into advantage. Mstislav's archers fired from above, from a favorable position. The first attack was repelled. The Mongols regrouped and tried again with a different force, different coordination, looking to overwhelm a specific point along the perimeter. The pressure was intense, relentless, calculated. The camp held. Stop and consider the weight of that. The army that had decimated the Khwarezmian Empire in 18 months, that had humiliated the Georgian army, that had massacred the Alans, that very afternoon had destroyed 2 Russian princes in open field. The army the world considered invincible. That army had attacked a wooden palisade of wagons arranged in a circle and been repelled. This was the weapon, not the sword, the terrain, the position, the decision not to play the enemy's game. By the end of the first day, Mstislav the Bold's hill still stood. On the second day, the story repeated itself. Mongol attacks, resistance from the position, the camp held. Mstislav maintained the discipline that was the foundation of everything. No sorties, no counterattacks, no reaction to the chaos beyond the perimeter. On the third day, Subutai changed his approach. If you cannot destroy a position by force, you isolate it. And if you isolate it long enough, the defenders run out of water, out of food, out of any prospect of relief that will never come. This is where Ploskina entered. Ploskina was the leader of the Brudniki, a semi-nomadic people of the southern steppes, something between Russian culture and steppe culture, intermediaries, a people who survived by serving whoever paid best. He had allied himself with the Mongols before the battle, and Subutai sent him to the besieged camp with a carefully crafted offer. The Mongols were offering honorable surrender. No noble blood would be shed. The princes and their troops would be released in exchange for ransom. Ploskina, being Christian like the Russians, swore in the name of God and the cross that the promise would be kept. Mstislav the Bold, after 3 days of siege, with no prospect of relief, every ally dead or fled, accepted. He came down from the hill with his men. 3 days. 3 days of resistance against the greatest war machine of that century. A palisade that was never broken. A position that was never overcome by force. And the Mongols kept their promise in one narrow, technical sense, in a dimension that must be understood as deliberate cruelty dressed in formal compliance. They did not shed noble blood. The Russian princes were laid on the ground. Wooden planks were placed over them. The Mongol generals and their officers sat atop those planks to celebrate their victory banquet. Mstislav Romanovich, Prince of Kiev, the only commander on the field of the Kalka River who had not taken the bait, who had proven across 3 days of resistance that there existed a weapon capable of denying the Mongols the battle they wanted, died suffocated beneath the floorboards of a victory feast while his conquerors celebrated above him. The lesson was buried with him. But it was not lost. It is here, in what that hill withstood. And it is worth understanding what it proved, not to rewrite 1223, but because the pattern Mstislav the Bold discovered out of necessity appears again and again, on other fields, other centuries, other armies that face the same horsemen. The question is not what should have happened at the Kalka. The question is what it taught about how the Mongols could be stopped and why no one listened. After the Kalka River, the Mongols did what a successful reconnaissance army does. They collected what they needed and left. But before leaving, there were accounts to settle. Mstislav the Daring, who had escaped the siege, crossed the Dnieper with what remained of his force and destroyed the boats behind him to slow the pursuit, had survived. Many of his men had not. Columns of Mongol cavalry swept through southern Russian territory. The city of Novgorod Svyatopolch was sacked. Other villages and outposts were destroyed. In total, 6 Russian princes died in the fighting and its aftermath. And then the Mongols stopped. They were within viable marching distance of larger cities. They had momentum on their side. They had the kind of crushing victory that typically preceded a conquest campaign. And they left, not out of mercy, out of strategy. Jebi and Subutai had not been sent to conquer Russia. They had been sent to map it. And Kalka had delivered intelligence of incalculable value, the political structure of the principalities and their internal divisions, the reliability, or lack thereof, of the Cuman contingents, the crossing points of the great rivers, and one specific data point that Subutai certainly noted with care: a well-prepared defensive position on high ground could withstand a direct Mongol assault for at least 3 days. Note what Subutai had done with the coalition, the same division he had used to destroy the Alans, the same diplomatic overture that had worked before, the same method, this time delivered not merely through ambassadors, but embedded within 9 days of retreat that taught the princes they were winning. Subutai's signature had not changed, only the stage. The return route ran north. And here something worth noting occurred. The Volga Bulgars ambushed the returning column. They inflicted real casualties. Not enough to stop Subutai, but enough to appear in the report. JB died at some point during this return campaign. The exact circumstances are lost in the sources. Subutai rode east, reported to Genghis Khan, and waited. The Russian princes who survived returned to their cities. They held funerals, and for the most part, they changed nothing. 14 years. In 1237, Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, arrived with a far larger army and clearly conquest-driven objectives, armed with all the intelligence Subutai had gathered in the summer of 1223. The campaign that followed destroyed most of the great Russian cities, and shaped the fate of the region for the next 2 centuries. The Mongols let them survive in 1223, not out of generosity, because they hadn't yet finished preparing what they were going to do next. So what should have happened? Imagine a different coalition, not one with more troops or fewer princes, but one with unified command and the discipline to use what it had. Imagine that when the Mongols began their retreat from Khortytsia, the coalition did not give chase, that instead of running after the fleeing enemy, it consolidated positions at river crossings, anchored itself to the terrain, and forced the Mongols to advance toward them under conditions they hadn't chosen. What happens to a cavalry army that specializes in mobility and envelopment when there is no open field available? What happens to the feigned retreat when the enemy simply doesn't follow? Mstislav the Bold answered those questions in practice. 3 days of Mongol attacks repelled. Not because the Prince of Kiev was an exceptional military genius, but because he had applied a straightforward principle. Deny the enemy the terrain he needs. Force him to fight on your terms, not his. The feigned retreat works because the opposing army pursues it. If they don't pursue, it doesn't work. If the entire coalition had stopped, consolidated, and forced the Mongols to attack prepared positions, Subutai's 9 days would have been 9 wasted days. The pattern appears at other moments in Mongol history. In Japan, stone seawalls along the coast made landing prohibitively costly. In Hungary, specific fortresses held out for months because cavalry is not an effective siege weapon. Novgorod survived in part due to geographic position. The Achilles heel of that until then unstoppable force was always the same: terrain where cavalry could not operate freely. Why wasn't the lesson passed on? The reason is simple and brutal. Mstislav the Bold died. The survivors of Kalka were the ones who had fled. Those who fled had not seen the hill hold. They were running in the opposite direction when it happened. And those who could have taught what the hill had proven died suffocated before they could say a word. The victors write history. But sometimes the only thing the victors teach the next generation is how to lose the same way, forever. The Mongols did not win at Kalka because they were invincible. They won because the coalition had voluntarily built, day by day, pursuit after pursuit, the exact conditions Subutai needed for the battle he had planned. Vanity, disunity, and the inability to resist the psychology of victory after victory handed the coldest strategist of the century the battlefield he wanted. And the only person who had refused to play that game was silenced before anyone could ask why. If you've made it this far, you now know something that most people who have studied the Mongols do not. At the Kalka River on May 31st, 1223, there was a weapon that worked. A hill, a palisade, wagons in a circle. A prince who said no to the pursuit when everyone else said yes. This is not a story of inevitable defeat. It is a story of a possible victory that history left behind. If you want to explore more stories like this, battles where the outcome depended not on brute force but on a decision almost no one saw, a tactic almost no one remembered, this channel has much more for you. Leave a like if this story was worth your time, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, and we'll see you in the next one.